Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is The War of the Worlds, H.G. Wells and the Wasteland. I saw with my own eyes the Sibyl at Cumae hanging in a cage, and when the boys said to her, "Sibyl, what do you want?" she answered, "I want to die." Gaius Petronius, the Satyricon. To see a world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour. William Blake, Auguries of Innocence. Well, hi everybody. This talk should be just over an hour, and I hope it doesn't feel like an eternity. I normally leave the epigraphs hanging for, full dramatic effect, but I'd ask you to just remember them if you can, because they will be relevant all the way through, and then I'll return to them at the very end and hopefully tie everything up in what could otherwise be quite a diverse talk, because this is your main guy, H.G. Wells. And of course, I'll be looking at the War of the Worlds. In a couple of days after this video, there's going to be a live stream where with Darren McGee and Richard Grannon, we talk about the text in more detail. But today I wanted to give some weird and wonderful context and link it, as I always do on this channel, with artistic output, artistic artworks, visual art, poetry, and just show you, and also, unusually for me, quite a few scientific images today, and try and tie it all together. Of philosophy as well, I almost forgot to mention. Now, if I'm totally honest, H.G. Wells isn't my cup of tea as a writer. He reminds me a bit of George Orwell. I recognise why he's important. I think the actual substantial impact of his work and some of the thoughts behind it are very important. It's just a question of taste. It's another reason similarly, I don't particularly like Hemingway. There's a certain style of writing, and to be fair to me, which I do like to be, H.G. Wells didn't like writers like Joseph Conrad. They had a bit of few spats because he had a very direct type of writing, H.G. Wells, and he wanted to make points, he wanted to be utilitarian in the effect of his work, and we'll talk about that very shortly. So he wasn't really into arty-farty, flowery language, so he would not have liked Proust. And personally, I do like that type of stuff, so purely from that point of view. But what's interesting about him to me is that despite the fact H.G. Wells had this, so for example, he believed politically he was more famous for his non-fiction writing in his own lifetime, arguably. So he did this book, The Outline of History, and I think in financial terms it made him a fortune. He was an amateur historian, but it was a history of the world. He wasn't unambitious, or HG. And he, as part of, he wrote this world history. Also in his politics, he had this, I think personally, mad as a box of frogs idea that we should try and create through education a world citizenry and one world government, and we needed a brotherhood of man, like a Coca-Cola advert on steroids, teach the world to sing. And the idea that, individual governments are incompetent and bad enough, the idea that you can have a worldwide, global, incompetent bureaucrat fest, I just find it bewildering that anyone could be so naive. But he was. He really believed in this stuff. And what I find interesting about that is his actual novel, War of the Worlds, contradicts the allegory that I think is contained within it, contradicts what H.G. Wells himself thought about a lot of political issues. So it's interesting how art can almost undermine the artist and their own intentions, because the artwork takes on a life of its own. And with that in mind, the wasteland is going to be a theme running all the way through. So T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, I will use quotes strategically interspersed as we go along, so just be aware of that. I'll point them out as we do. And just to give some historical context, so that was his lifespan. War of the Worlds, I think it was serialized in a magazine in 1897, and then it was published as a novel in 1898. And at the same time, Heart of Dark, I mentioned Joseph Conrad, but Heart of Darkness, which really is to my taste, that was 1899, as was, I think, Freud's interpretation of dreams. So, there's quite a lot of literature at the time. What's his name? H. Rider Haggard was writing novels like She and King Solomon's Mines. I think they were mid 1880s. There was a book called The Invasion of England by I don't think it's very well known now at all, but W.F. Butler, and that was 1892, and that was all. I think that was about the Germans potentially invading. So there was literature around at the time about invasion, and War of the World is obviously about a Martian invasion. You've got Freud and the concept of the dreamscape, and I'll be illustrating those type of the dream element of the era in which H.G. Wells is writing with reference to a French illustrator, Odilon Redon, and some of his really weird charcoal and ink drawings. So the colonial thing, H. Rider Haggard and H.G. Wells, they're writing in a time when in England, the UK, Great Britain, there was this sense, a Victorian sense, that the empire was coming to an end, or there were threats from the outside. So he's made it into a Martian invasion. But as we go along, I'm going to point out to you, it's not about the Martians at all. I'm going to suggest the novel, The War of the Worlds. The world at war is actually the world we live in, and we're at war with ourselves. Society's fragmenting. In particular, the pace of technological change. So Victorian people went out and colonized other people, and they were less technologically developed than us. But the Victorians, there's a reverse colonization in books like Bram Stoker's Dracula. The so-called primitive, the so-called, the less technologically developed, come back into the empire, and a type of reverse colonialism. And that is one of the issues, I think, that's under the surface of the whole novel. To what extent are we primitive? To what extent do we have primal urges? And to what extent would another more technologically advanced civilization, how would they view us? So these are the interesting ideas he's playing with. And then I'm not going to use Schopenhauer in this talk, but I wanted to flag him up at the beginning because I think his notion of the world as will and representation really does underline some of the angles I'm going to take today. When I see this photograph of him, I always think of that song Firestarter, but that's a slight aside. The world as will and representation. I'm just going to use a couple of quotes from Schopenhauer because I think they're fascinating for what I'm trying to do in this talk. They're highly relevant, but I've got a lot to say, and I didn't want to go away too much from H.G. Wells, so I'll limit it to a couple of quotations. But in the world as will and representation, the notion of will is an underlying life force idea. And Schopenhauer's arguing that as human beings, we try and represent that underlying life force in various ways. That concept is crucial to what I'll be talking about in the rest of the images I use, especially the scientific ones. But this notion of an underlying will and how we represent it obviously lends itself to issues of aesthetics, how we portray in an artistic format. So this is from the aesthetic section of The World as Will and Representation. Therefore, so long as our consciousness is filled by our will, so long as we are given up to the throng of desires with their constant hopes and fears, so long as we are the subject of willing, we can never have lasting happiness nor peace. It is essentially all the same whether we pursue or flee, fear injury or seek enjoyment. The care for the constant demands of the will, in whatever form it may be, continually occupies and sways the consciousness. But without peace, no true well-being is possible. So Schopenhauer's his notion of the will is just this never-ending life force, this desire to survive and exert yourself in the world. This is why the man who is tormented by passion or want or care is so suddenly revived, cheered, and restored by a single free glance into nature. The storm of passion, the pressure of desire and fear, and all the miseries of willing, arc then at once, and in a marvellous manner, calmed and appeased. For at the moment at which, freed from the will, we give ourselves up to pure, will-less knowing, we pass into a world from which everything is absent that influenced our will and moved us so violently through it. So this is where it leads to the notion of aesthetics, and this is what I'm going to be arguing all the way through this talk, that the realm of aesthetics, A, represents the underlying reality of existence, and I'll be using this with reference to pictures from NASA of space and also microscopic images. So that's the first thing. But also, not just representing this underlying will, this life force, the contemplation when you enjoy the aesthetic appreciation of art and reflection upon the life force in an aesthetic form, it gives you temporary, Schopenhauer's a pessimistic bugger, but it gives you temporary relief from the stress of this constant will. This freeing of knowledge lifts us as wholly and entirely away from all that, as do sleep and dreams. Happiness and unhappiness have disappeared. We are no longer individual. The individual is forgotten. We are only pure subject of knowledge. We are only that one eye of the world which looks out from all knowing creatures, but which can become perfectly free from the service of will in man alone. So that is a huge claim for the power of art. We are the unique species on Earth. And this will be relevant to H.G. Wells and the concept of the Martians invading us. I get a strong sense from his novel the Martians didn't spend an awful lot of time reading Proust or looking at Cezanne, as we're going to. Now, this is just, I want to get this out of the way, this is my puerile sense of humour. this is what I think of when I think of the Martians invading. And it comes from, if you're from Liverpool, there was a very famous, very odd comedian called Ken Dodd. And this is my favourite joke. He died a few years ago, but this is my favourite joke he ever told. What a beautiful day for sticking a cucumber through the vicar's letterbox and shouting, "The Martians have landed." So I just wanted to get that out of the way. Now, these are the early quotes from War of the Worlds, so that I'm very conscious that as we proceed, someone in the comments will probably say, you didn't talk much about the novel. But just to prove everything, that's how you sound in my head, you lot. But this, just, this actual precise quote, I think there'll be another one, and then I'm going to quote from the very end. So, I almost don't want to read it, because Richard Burton, if you've heard of the musical, which, by the way, I'll put a link in the description. There's a supporter of the channel, James Cox, has done a podcast discussion of the Jeff Wayne's very famous musical version of War of the Worlds. And at the beginning, Richard Burton reads out the opening quotations. And what a voice to die for, Richard Burton. Amazing voice. But I'll do my Mardy Ringo Starr version. No one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that this world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's and yet as mortal as his own. That as men busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. So that's absolutely crucial for the purposes of my talk, this very early quote in the book. And in the social context, in Victorian times, the microscope was massively popular. Gentlemen scientists, amateur scientists would look through them. And I think it's not a unique, but it's a feature of the novel War of the Worlds, where the narrator takes this detached view And it's almost like society, I think it's a key aspect of the novel, society is being looked at as if under a microscope. And I'm fascinated by the links between this type of image, which is bacteria under a microscope, and it's not a million miles from what you'd see, you know, the other technology at the time that was very popular. This is a French photograph from the mid 1880s, so very contemporaneous with when H.G. Wells was writing. And this is bacteria again. I think this is what's known as an old testate amoeba shell. But I hope you'd accept or recognize with me that that's almost like a picture from outer space, and I'll be exploring this notion of space and how it is the mirror image, almost, so to speak, of the microscopic image. So outer space and deep inner space. I think one of the main messages of the book, as I'm going to interpret it in this talk, is how surprisingly linked the vast differences in space and time can actually be. So with infinite complacency, this is the continuation of the initial quotation in the novel. With infinite complacency, men went to and fro over this globe about their little affairs, serene in their assurance of their empire over matter, the empire reference. It is possible that the infusoria under the microscope do the same. No one gave a thought to the older worlds of space as sources of human danger, or thought of them only to dismiss the idea of life upon them as impossible or improbable. So again, this focus upon it is possible that the, I'm assuming it's infusoria under the microscope, do the same. So this microscopic, it is a powerful aspect of the book. You've got the aliens looking down, the Martians looking down on Earth, as if a Victorian amateur scientist is looking through a microscope. And the oddness of what you actually see in microscopes is going to be a constant refrain all the way through this talk. But these are apparently diatoms, single cell algae. Shame on you if you didn't know that. But the alien nature of what you can see, this is my point about the aliens above us in outer space in the novel, but also what was being seen at the time. This is a modern microscope, but it's not a million miles from what the Victorians were looking at. Now, this next quote is absolutely crucial. It's towards the very end of the novel, so plot spoiler, but the Martians die eventually, not because we militarily defeat them, but slain by the put my teeth back in, putrefactive and disease bacteria against which their systems were unprepared, slain after all man's devices had failed, by the humblest things that God in his wisdom has put upon this earth. These germs of disease have taken toll of humanity since the beginning of things, taken toll of our pre-human ancestors since life began here. But by virtue of this natural selection of our kind, we have developed resisting power. To no germs do we succumb without a struggle, and to many, those that cause putrefaction in dead matter, for instance, our living frames are altogether immune. I'm asking you to remember a lot of things, but if you could remember what I've emboldened there, we have developed resisting power. Because in some senses, and this is why I referenced Schopenhauer earlier on, I think the human ability to interpret the world aesthetically through the power of art is actually part of this resisting power that H.G. Wells is talking about in bacterial terms. But as I'll show you as we go along, I think you can link this to art, and I'll see whether I can convince you or not. But there are no bacteria in Mars, and directly these invaders arrived, directly they drank and fed, our microscopic allies began to work their overthrow. Already when I watched them, they were irrevocably doomed, dying and rotting even as they went to and fro. It was inevitable. By the toll of 1 billion deaths, man has bought his birthright of the earth, and it is his against all comers. It would still be his were the Martians 10 times as mighty as they are, for neither do men live nor die in vain. So this is, I think, the actual allegory of the book. And someone in the comments, in a different context, they were talking about a past video I did on Gregory Bateson, and it was the relationship between logic and context. And if you think about it, the Martians are the absolute epitome of a technologically developed. Their bodies have receded, and they have to have these technological enhancements, these outer shells. And their bodies are almost unimportant. It's all about the power of their minds and about reason and about technological power. And I think that's an allegory for humankind is also increasingly developing that way. And at the Victorian era, when H.G. Wells was writing, you've got massive sudden increase in technological capability, and link that to the colonial era, where that technological power was meeting less technologically developed people. So I think specifically H.G. Wells referenced Tasmania and how the Tasmanians were wiped out in a very short period of time by Western colonizers. So you've got these practical historical influences. But my strong argument I'd like to make is that this idea of the Martians as a metaphor for the concepts, conceptualization, rationalization, taken out of the context of physical material world. And this has important implications. And this is why I was saying it goes against H.G. Wells' own belief. He was a strong advocate of scientific reason and the power of science. And that's all good, for predictability, for controlling the environment. Science is absolutely brilliant. But the question that H.G. Wells' own novel asks is what happens when you take things out of context? So the Martians have come from a different planet, and they're killed by the simplest thing, simple bacteria. And my argument is that is an example of the way in which reason misses the smallest nuance. And I'm going to argue as we go along, providing visual examples, that one of the key elements of being human is the nuance, the materiality of very small things. Think back to the early epigraph. If you can find the universe in a grain of sand, that's what I'm talking about. And that's what the Martians didn't have. And that's why they died out. Now, the next image I find absolutely fascinating. So I think, tell me whether I'm losing it, there's almost a hint of a Martian face there. And now you might be interested if I tell you what it actually is. It's an artist called Marcus Desieno, and I've put a link to his work in the description box. And what it actually is, it's a photograph of the Pleiades star cluster. I think it's on photographic film. I think it's an original NASA picture. And he put on the photographic film a piece of bacteria found, and he describes it as found on a public bathroom's door handle. And then he just lets the bacteria do its job on the photographic film plate. So you've got a picture of outer space, and then you've got the bacteria from a public bathroom door handle. And you can guess, but I won't even tell you what other titles he's given some of his works. Absolutely disgusting. But this interplay between the representation, to put it in Schopenhauer's terms, will and representation. You have the will of the bacteria, and you have the representation, the photographic film of outer space. And when the two meet, it wiped out the Martians. But this is what it can actually do in artistic terms. It's absolutely brilliant. I just think what a genius idea to put the two together. And I think at the beginning of Marcus Desenio's website, there's this quote from Blaise Pascal: "Man is equally incapable of seeing the nothingness from which he emerges and the infinity in which he is engulfed," which I think is a highly relevant statement. And he goes on. So that was Pensée 72, and then Pensée 347. And the Pensées, by the way, they're readily available online. He's a great writer, prose writer, Pascal. But this is another one. "Man is but a reed, the most feeble thing in nature. But he is a thinking reed. The entire universe need not arm itself to crush him." That reminded me of the Martians coming to get us. "A vapour, a drop of water suffices to kill him. But if the universe," and the vapour is what the Martians tried to kill us with, remember, in the book. "But if the universe were to crush him, man would still be more noble than that which killed him, because he knows that he dies, and the advantage which the universe has over him. The universe knows nothing of this." So again, it relates to the whole Schopenhauer ability to contemplate aesthetically our human condition is what gives us temporary respite. And then to take this back to the world of bacteria, Aspergillus oryzae koji, growing on rice kernels. It's a bacteria. So this is a highly magnified image of rice kernels, and this is the bacteria. And then this was the Belgian edition of The War of the Worlds. And I think it's a Brazilian artist, who I'll be showing you more of his pictures very shortly. Corrêa, I think the surname is. I'll have to wait for the slide to come up. I have the memory of a goldfish. I just think it's quite interesting. Sorry, if you go back that way. They're not a million miles. I'll give you better examples, but the spindly alien creatures and the bacteria, not a million miles dissimilar. So this is again War of the Worlds. I lied, I'm using another quote. So this is when the fear starts hitting humankind. "So you understand the roaring wave of fear that swept through the greatest city in the world." Obviously, he's referring to London at the time of, was deemed to be the greatest city in the world. "Just as Monday was dawning, the stream of flight rising swiftly to a torrent, lashing in a foaming tumult around the railway stations, banked up into a horrible struggle about the shipping in the Thames, and hurrying by every available channel northward and eastward. By 10 o'clock, the police organisation, and by midday, even the railway organisations, were losing coherency." It doesn't take till 10 o'clock or midday in modern UK for the trains and police to lose the plot, but I risk going off on one. "Were losing coherency, just as I did, losing shape and efficiency, guttering, softening, running at last in that swift liquefaction of the social body." So this, I think, is the key to the book, the idea that the fear of society breaking down, Wells has projected onto a Martian invasion what actually people were fearful of at the time. And again, if you think in terms of bacteria, this idea of the liquefaction of the social body, that's what we're made up of. And then to focus in on, because I was going to say H.G. Wells, he started it, so I'll finish it. But this idea, the microscope, so this is a scientist writing about the role of the microscope throughout history. and of this time that H.G. Wells was writing. The microscope revealed myriads of shapes and creatures, so utterly unfamiliar that writers on the subject resorted to flamboyant prose in order to render them intelligible. This had reverberations not least for the visual arts, which I'll be showing you. The metaphors chosen by authors attempting to describe the microscopic world soon developed a visual presence, with supernatural features being projected even onto illustrations in supposedly scientific contexts. So this interests me. It's the closer you get to finding the scientific truth through things like photographs of outer space, and I'll be giving you more examples shortly, and through microscopes, it's not, science in some ways doesn't make the world, it makes the world more understandable, but simultaneously it can also make the world more magical. And it's interesting to me the correspondence between the reality of scientific images and the imaginations of artists. So I'm going to show you now a series of microscopic images and how you can see them being reflected in the imagination of artists. So this is a free-swimming protozoan Giardia, or Giardia I think it's called. And I like the additional description, which causes diarrhea and other symptoms when it infects the small intestine. I don't mean to boast, but I think I'd have struggle in surviving in my small intestine, given what goes on in there. And then the next is potentially my favourite weird picture. It's hilarious, isn't it? But these are various worms at thermal vents, a microscopic size. They can survive extreme temperatures, apparently. I think there's a whole range of them, but they can be collectively referred to sometimes as bristle worms. But this is one of the illustrators of the War of the Worlds, a guy called Warwick Goble, I think it is. And it's not, I hope you can say, or you'd agree, it's not a million miles away. That's another Goble illustration. And then I almost thought of using the next one as my thumbnail, but it would scare off the few viewers that I have. So this is one of these bristle worms, I think. Polychaetes, I think they're called scientifically. He's hit a few rungs falling off the ugly tree, hasn't he? But I'm now going to show you an image. This is my point about how these relate to the imagination of artists. This is one of the images from Odilon Redon, the French illustrator. And then be careful, the next one, he really is an ugly bugger, so don't say I didn't warn you. But another actual thermal worm in the deep depths of the ocean. I'll spend a fortune at the dentist. And then this is just by the by, I just found this beautiful. This is a slightly mangled, he's missing body parts, but this is actually a mosquito under the microscope. And I'm just pointing out how someone like H.G. Wells, influenced by, I'm guessing, the microscopic culture of the, I don't mean the culture of the time was incredibly small, I mean the culture surrounding microscopes and their use. I think it, can partially explain how the imagination of people like H.G. Wells was informed or affected. So now to bring in some references from the wasteland, finally. So, unreal city, under the brown fog of a winter dawn. A crowd flowed over London Bridge, so many. I had not thought death had undone so many. Sighs, short and infrequent, were exhaled, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet. So this is quite a famous phrase from The Wasteland, and it's based on when he says, "I had not thought death had undone so many." In Dante's Inferno, there's the line, "And after there was so long a train of people that I never would have believed that death had so many had undone." So that's, The Wasteland is filled with references. The notes that T.S. Eliot produced for The Wasteland are significantly longer. Is it something like 432 lines or something, the actual poem itself? But there's an immense number of literary and historical references in it. One of which was the epigraph about the Sibyl of Cumae, which I'll be returning to at the very end. But if you think, he's talking obviously again about London, unreal city under the brown fog of a winter dawn. So here's a contemporary photograph. I think this is from the 1920s. And I really liked, there's a comment from T.S. Eliot when he's talking about his own poem, The Wasteland. "Various critics have done me the honour to interpret the poem in terms of criticism of the contemporary world. I've considered it, indeed, as an important bit of social criticism. To me, it was only the relief of a personal and wholly insignificant grouse against life. It is just a piece of rhythmical grumbling." So I think my channel is a piece of unrhythmical grumbling by that reckoning. And to show you some of the links, I'm not just showing this for the good of my health, believe it or not. The relevance to H.G. Wells and his work in general, not just The War of the Worlds. The character in The Island of Dr. Moreau, Edward Prendick, he returns to London, and this is what's written. H.G. Wells writes of his experience back in London. "I would go out into the streets to fight with my delusion, and prowling women would mew after me. Furtive, craving men glanced jealously at me. Weary, pale workers go coughing by me with tired eyes and eager paces, like wounded deer dripping blood. Old people, bent and dull, pass murmuring to themselves, and all unheeding a ragged tale of gibing children. Particularly nauseous were the blank, expressionless faces of people in trains and omnibuses. They seemed no more my fellow creatures than dead bodies would be." Yeah, I thought I was misanthropic. I think Edward is challenging me. But I came across this. This is an American artist called Bill Sienkiewicz, and that was his illustration, which I think is pretty good. In terms of, it's not Cezanne, but in terms of expressing what was in that quote. And again, just so that was H.G. Wells' a different novel to War of the Worlds, but then, despite the fact I don't think he liked Joseph Conrad's work, this is Marlowe returning back to Brussels, when the character in The Heart of Darkness, after he's been into the depths of the Congo. "I found myself back in the sepulchral city, resenting the sight of people hurrying through the streets to filch a little money from each other, to devour their infamous cookery, to gulp their unwholesome beer, to dream their insignificant and silly dreams. They trespassed upon my thoughts. They were intruders whose knowledge of life was to me an irritating pretense, because I felt so sure they could not possibly know the things I knew. I had no particular desire to enlighten them, but I had some difficulty in restraining myself from laughing in their faces." So again, this notion of social disintegration, the body politic, the social body breaking down. This idea he's been to an undeveloped, primitive place. He's seen things, and he comes back and he finds everything incredibly superficial and shallow. So this is 1899, a year after the War of the Worlds. And then this is Les Demoiselles d'Avignon by Picasso, and this is 1907. So just under a decade later. And this idea that he said, I think Picasso, he said was inspired by a painting. He was inspired to do this painting. He went to an exhibition of African sculpture at the Trocadero Ethnographic Museum. So in the figures on the right, they're African masks they're wearing, the women. But the way Cubism developed this fragmented visual aesthetic, it reflected the time when people were feeling, I mentioned at the very beginning, these threats from the outside that H.G. Wells represented as Martians were already within inside the society. And this is the guy I mentioned who illustrated. There was another, Goble illustrated, and I don't think H.G. Wells particularly liked his illustrations. But this guy, H.G. Wells, I think it was his favourite illustrator. So I'm pretty sure he was Brazilian. And if you think back to the cucumber through the letterbox, this notion of the invasiveness. So yes, the Martians are invading, but it really is a physical invasiveness. Remember those bacteria on top of the rice kernels? And then I think he was a bit of an erotic illustrator as well, Corrêa. Ooh, Mr. Martian, what large tentacles you have. But again, not a million miles from some of the bacteria I was showing you. Now, this isn't The Wasteland, but this is one of my favourite poems, T.S. Eliot's The Second Coming, this idea of societal fragmentation. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. And this is one of the illustrations, again. The ceremony of innocence is drowned. I think that's not a bad illustration. And a powerful theme throughout the novel that's recognised in these illustrations is the normality that gets broken by the invasion. Sorry, I got a bunged up nose. And again from The Wasteland, I think we are in Rat's Alley, where the dead men lost their bones. Another Corrêa illustration from War of the Worlds. And then this was H.G. Wells talking himself. In those days, I was writing this was an interview he did. In those days, I was writing short stories, and the particular sort of short story that amused me most to do was the vivid realization of some disregarded possibility in such a way as to comment on the false securities and fatuous self-satisfaction of the everyday life as we knew it then. Because in those days, the conviction that history had settled down to a sort of jog-trot comedy was very widespread indeed. Tragedy, people thought, had gone out of human life forever. A few of us were trying to point out the obvious possibilities of flying, of great guns, of poison gas, and so forth, in presently making life uncomfortable if some sort of world peace was not assured. But the books we wrote were regarded as the silliest of imaginative gymnastics. Well, the world knows better now. And if you think he's writing 1920, the horrors of the 1930s and 40s had yet to come. So this idea of the aliens, it goes to my point about Wells is representing in fiction, literary fiction, the general fears of the society at the time he's projecting. When I see this one, it always makes me think of the Second World War. You know, the transatlantic convoys being attacked by the Germans. And then I'm using this one. This is still a Corrêa illustration, but the weird use of the eyes. And I think this links quite well with, I've mentioned him, this is the guy himself, Odilon Redon. And I'll now show you a series of his illustrations interspersed with quotes from The Wasteland. So this is The Wasteland again. What is that noise? The wind under the door. What is that noise now? What is the wind doing? Nothing, again nothing. Do you know nothing? Do you see nothing? Do you remember nothing? I remember those are pearls that were his eyes. I think that's a reference to The Tempest. But this is Odilon Redon's, one of his weird illustrations. But if you remember that quote, I remember those are pearls that were his eyes. And then this is from The Time Machine, another H.G. Wells story, where he says, the peculiar risk lay in the possibility of my finding some substance in the space which I or the machine occupied. So long as I travelled at a high velocity through time, this scarcely mattered. I was, so to speak, attenuated, was slipping like a vapour through the interstices of intervening substances. That's a difficult phrase to say. The interstices of intervening substances. And I think that has huge relevance for today. I always mention on this channel, you know, the reports and the analyses that people like Jonathan Haidt do on the anxious generation, adolescence, mental health, this idea of a sense of identity feeling like it's slipping away because of social media and the amount of time spent online. And to give you, just to show how far back this goes, this is a guy, Walter Pater, who wrote this brilliant book, The Renaissance Studies in Art and Poetry. And he had to alter the conclusion because the conclusion is all about the way in which our individuality is breaking down. And it was perceived at the time as being immoral. I think he was going for a position in the Church of England, and he kept failing to get it because of the controversy his theory of individuality in art caused. So he's spoken about the physical world and the laws, and a bit like Schopenhauer and the will to life. And then he talks about how different it is if you think of individual consciousness. So having spoken about the physical world and its laws, or if we begin with the inward world of thought and feeling, the whirlpool is still more rapid, the flame more eager and devouring. There it is, no longer the gradual darkening of the eye and fading of colour from the wall, the movement of the shore side where the water flows down indeed, though in apparent rest, but the race of the midstream, a drift of momentary acts of sight and passion and thought. At first sight, experience seems to bury us under a flood of external objects, pressing upon us with a sharp and importunate reality, calling us out of ourselves in 1,000 forms of action. But when reflection begins to act upon those objects, they are dissipated under its influence. The cohesive force seems suspended like a trick of magic. Each object is loose into a group of impressions, colour, odour, texture in the mind of the observer. And this was called The Human Plant by Redon, circa 1880, this one. . . 。 . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . And if we continue to dwell in thought on this world, not of objects and the solidity with which language invests them, but of impressions unstable, flickering, inconsistent, which burn and are extinguished with our consciousness of them, it contracts still further. The whole scope of observation is dwarfed to the narrow chamber of the individual mind. Experience, already reduced to a swarm of impressions, is ringed round for each one of us by that thick wall of personality through which no real voice has ever pierced on its way to us, or from us to that which we can only conjecture to be without. Every one of those impressions is the impression of the individual in his isolation, each mind keeping as a solitary prisoner in its own dream of a world. So this is the general cultural atmosphere about fears of how our individuality was fragmenting in a context of rapid social change and technological change. And that's the context in which H.G. Wells was writing, is the point I'm trying to make. But this phrase, every one of those impressions is the impression of the individual in his isolation, each mind keeping as a solitary prisoner in its own dream of a world. And I find this next Redon image quite haunting. And then there's a series of images that are all about. So if you go back to each mind keeping as a solitary prisoner in its own dream of a world, and then this series of images, I think, all illustrate that phrase. And relate back to this notion of the microscopic that H.G. Wells starts the whole book with. And I love the title for this one. This is "And the eyes without heads were floating like mollusks." That's from 1896. So it's very close to the War of the Worlds publication date. And this is called "Is There Not an Invisible World?" Analysis goes a step further still and assures us that those impressions of the individual mind to which, for each one of us, experience dwindles down, are in perpetual flight, that each of them is limited by time, and that as time is infinitely divisible, each of them is infinitely divisible also. All that is actual in it being a single moment, gone while we try to apprehend it, of which it may ever be more truly said that it has ceased to be than it is. To such a tremulous wisp constantly reforming itself on the stream, to a single sharp impression, with a sense in it, a relic more or less fleeting of such moments gone by. What is real in our life finds itself down. It is with this movement, with the passage and dissolution of impressions, images, sensations, that analysis leaves off. That continual vanishing away, that strange perpetual weaving and unweaving of ourselves. Now, two quick things I'd say about that. One is, I think that's a brilliant summary of what Proust is writing about with his constant references to memory and the past, à la recherche de temps perdu, in search of lost time. But I want to now give you a series of images that I think, to go back to the Schopenhauer idea, this notion of the will to life, this underlying life force, that I think there are various visual representations of the main sense behind this quote I've just read from Pater. So that strange perpetual weaving and unweaving of ourselves, this is what we feel in consciousness. But I'm suggesting it's also in the world around us, and we can see images of it. So this beautiful image, it's a cross-section of lichen that's been stained and then use a light microscope. And please tell me in the comments if you think I've just lost it, but I see this as having relevance in Schopenhauer's sense to the art that also tries to capture the essence of reality. So I'm sure you could probably come up with better examples on your own, but these were just some very initial ideas that I got from just looking at this scientific image. So this is Poppies at Giverny by Claude Monet, 1887. Again, Giverny, Field of Poppies, 1885. And just to... It's just the layer of flowers and the way it's then represented in art. And in that particular painting, also the division, the blackness, the horizon that's created by the darkness of the light microscope is replicated somewhat by the trees. And it made me think, I've never really thought about, it's an obvious thing the way artists use the horizon, but the way they link the horizon and they use darkness and shade. And there's again Monet, Fields of Flowers and Windmills near Leiden, 1886. And again, if you can just look at that image of the flowers, and that was the original. And then this is Poppy Field by Vincent van Gogh from 1890. And ironically, this artist is called Guy Rose. But I think they're poppies. That's 1910. And this just set me off, so apologies, like I say, if you think I've lost it. But this is Oscillatoria filamentus Cyanobacteria. That's a good score at Scrabble. But that's what the bacteria is. And that's what it reminded me of. Monet's Wheat Field from 1881. And this again is Van Gogh, The Fields from 1890. And this might be a stretch, I totally accept that, but I just see elements. It's like that film Sixth Sense. I see dead people. I see bacteria all the time now. I was actually cooking mushrooms the other night when I was after I was working on this video, and I've never cleaned mushrooms so much. And this is an image I used very early on the channel. It's Tree Roots by Van Gogh, one of the last paintings he ever did. But this thing about the way artists can get to the essence of reality and to go back, this is all stimulated by the opening quote in The War of the Worlds. And I appreciate this isn't what most people would take from the novel, but just the way he described humankind and our Earth being looked at as if under a microscope. I think it's what artists do anyway. But they actually found what they think is the original spot where this was taken. So that's a photograph. And there you've got the painting superimposed. And these are the type of links I was seeing. And this is another one of those, the interaction of the bacteria and the photographic plate of a outer space photograph. So this is called a photograph of the Milky Way eaten by bacteria found in unpasteurized milk. Again, it's Marcos de Ciento. And then they start getting really wacky. So I love this one. This is called a photograph of a star cluster eaten by bacteria found on a light switch. And I appreciate it's not a direct match, but these are just loose associations I'm making. But this is what that reminded me of. It's one of Monet's very late paintings of the Japanese bridge. I love the titles Marcus gives these things. So this is called a photograph of the Andromeda galaxy eaten by bacteria found on an ATM machine. And that reminds me of Jean Fautrier's work. It reminds me of, who was I showing the other day? Not Bacon, the other guy. I've just had a senior moment. Who's the Auerbach, Frank Auerbach? Some of the faces and the thickness of the paint. But again, I don't think it's a million miles from Monet. And what I think why I was biased to showing Monet is because Monet is often deemed to be a bit of a biscuit tin, chintzy, kitschy, whereas in his later work, some of this depth of the thickness of the oils, because he was losing his eyesight, and just the intensity. So that, again, this is the Japanese bridge. This is called Water Lilies and Reflections of a Willow from 1916 to 1919. And seeing all these pictures of bacteria made me look at these paintings in just a different way. So the way he gets these, the water lilies, setting sun, 1920 to 26, it's the reflection, the water, the sky, the willows, everything is merged together. A bit like the bacteria eating the outer space, so that the smallest thing in the world, the bacteria, is interacting with the largest expanse of space, at least a representation of it. And this is called a photograph of a barred lenticular galaxy eaten by bacteria found in my belly button. Not mine, I hasten to add. If that was my belly button fluff, that would have eaten right through the photographic plate. And this is, I can't emphasize enough how subjective these associations are, but I would be interested if you want to give me abuse in the comments as to whether you see the links. But this reminded me of this. And this is a detail from, I'll show you the whole painting in a second, but this is a detail from Gustav Klimt's 1901 to 02, the goldfish. That's the actual full artwork. I'm not an art critic, but if I was, I think I'd describe this as being all about the base, as they say. All about the base. And then, again, I'll admit, I've never been a Klimt fan, but when you look at too many slides of weird bacteria, you start to see things in a completely different way. And on the left-hand side of this, again, it just reminds me the intensity of the bacteria eating the photographic plate. So this is a portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer, #1 from 1907. This is Buchenhain, 1902. Birch Forest from 1903. I'll quickly zip through them. This idea of the way in which the bacteria ate the plate and the effect it creates. Poppy Field from 1907. Like I say, never having been a fan of Klimt, it gave me a fresh appreciation. This is called A Horticultural Landscape with a Hilltop, 1916. This is Pear Tree from 1903. Park, succinctness or what? This is just called Park, 1909 to 1910. And again, that's the association. It just makes me think of it. This is called the Schlosskammer on the Attersee, #3 from 1910. Another Klimt. Anyway, I belabor the point, but I just thought that was vaguely interesting. And now to start concluding. So this is from Genesis: "For dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return." And Horace said, "We are but dust and shadow." And then to keep with this Martian scientific theme, this is it's known as the Horsehead Nebula, photographed in infrared light, which can see through the dust clouds. Normal photography, just all you can see is one big wall of dust. So this is the NASA Hubble Space Telescope. But what I found out, not knowing much about science at all, that the vast majority of matter in the universe is hydrogen and helium gas, and then most of the rest, or much of the rest, is dust. So outer space is full of this dust. You'd forgotten what it looked like, hadn't you? It's been that long. But here, Michael Werner, chief scientist at NASA for jet propulsion. The materials that go into making you or me a unique human being were generated in stars. They say that dust is our destiny and our origin. Based on observations beyond our own galaxy, it's clear that it's equally important throughout the universe. It's not just a local phenomenon. Other galaxies have just as much dust. I just quite like the idea that the whole basis, ashes from ashes, dust to dust, it actually is the origins of the universe. And I'm sure you already knew this, but this is a young star-forming region called NGC 3324 in the Corrêa Nebula. Shame on you if you didn't know that. But to develop this dust and to bring it back to the wasteland and to the War of the Worlds, this is a quote from The Wasteland. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images, where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. So a couple of things to pick out here. A heap of broken images. I think in the actual poem The Wasteland, T.S. Eliot's referring to all the cultural references that we've either lost or we've lost the full resonance of. And what I'm doing, it's a very rare occasion, I'm actually being optimistic, and I'm offering an alternative to the pessimism of T.S. Eliot here. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. And the notion of the red rocks, I'm building from the red rock, the dust, a heap of broken images. I want to mend some of those broken images through this relationship of the red rock and the handful of dust. So this is Cueva de las Manos in Santa Cruz, Argentina. And that's what's inside. I think that's from approximately 7000 BC, but they did stencils on the wall. So this notion of a handful of dust, I think in a positive way, it's not fear, it's human beings expressing themselves since time immemorial. A different type of red rock. Talking of rock, this is where we get silicon from. So it's silica rock. And remember, sand is what produces the glass for both the microscope and the telescope, which is what I started off discussing, this whole talk began with. And to go back to to bring all this together, to go back to the original epigraph, I saw with my own eyes the Sibyl Akumai hanging in a cage, and when the boys said to her, Sibyl, what do you want? She answered, I want to die. And the story was Phoebus or Apollo gave the option. He was trying to seduce the Sibyl, and so this is the origin story from the Metamorphoses, Ovid's Metamorphoses. While he was still hopeful, seeking to bend my will, this is the Sibyl speaking to Aeneas, I think. While he was still hopeful, seeking to bend my will with gifts, he told me, choose what you will, O maid, and you shall have it. I pointed to a heap of sand and uttered the foolish prayer that my years might be as many as there were sand grains in that mound. I should have asked that those years be forever young, but I forgot. And potentially the most poignant and significant, but I forgot, ever written. But I'm just further developing this notion of, remember the original epigraph to the William Blake, to find the universe in a grain of sand. The foolish prayer that my years might be as many as there were sand grains in that mound. But basically, the Sibyl here is describing being trapped eternally. And that's a different heap of sand. The other thing that sand makes, silicon makes, is silicon chips. And like the Sibyl, forever young, trapped in a bodiless existence, hanging in a cage. The fear is, instead of H.G. Wells and the Martians invading, perhaps the new fear in a rapidly technological age of rapid change, maybe this is the new invasion of the Martians. But to be optimistic, and remember, this is probably one of the first times on the channel, the idea that in the wasteland, remember the quote I've just given you about the shadow of the red rock, and I will show you fear in a handful of dust. This is the quarry, Bibimus quarry, that Cezanne based his paintings on. So this is the Bibimus quarry, circa 1900. And just to finish with some more literary references, so this is how far back these links go. So Isaiah, behold, a king will reign in righteousness, and princes will rule in justice. Each will be like a hiding place from the wind, a shelter from the storm, like streams of water in a dry place, like the shade of a great rock in a weary land. And that's Cezanne's Red Rock painting. To see a world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour. So just to tie everything up towards the end now, this reminded me, this idea, this is Blake's optimism that I'd put Blake and Cezanne up against the dead silicon of the AI chip and everything that implies. I just think it's a powerful image of the Sibyl hanging in a cage, this consciousness like AI, this intelligence just hanging in this silicon cage. But in volume 5 of In Search of Lost Time, known as The Captive, I've described it in a previous video. The fictional character Bagot, the author, drags himself off his sickbed that proves to be his deathbed, and he goes to see an exhibition. He's wanted to see the painting A View of Delft by Vermeer. A little patch of yellow wall, which he could not remember, was so well painted that it was, if one looked at it by itself, like some priceless specimen of Chinese art, of a beauty that was sufficient in itself. The precious substance of the tiny patch of yellow wall. He repeated to himself, little patch of yellow wall with a sloping roof, little patch of yellow wall. And that's the painting he's referring to. The sand in the foreground, appropriately enough. And then, depending upon your opinion, it's either the low far right, slightly upper far right, or the sloping roof that was mistaken as a piece of wall. Little patch of yellow wall. But if you think back to that picture of the silicon chip, I'm suggesting this is what humanity, through art, through the Schopenhauer notion of aesthetics, this is what we can put up against the bacteria that killed the Martians, they were in the wrong place. They lacked true context. They lacked the nuance. The tiny little thing was the thing that killed them. Bacteria has killed humanity for billions of years, but we've survived, and arguably part of the life force. The tiny thing, the little details, the little patch of yellow wall, that's like our antibody. That's what gives us. Remember Blaise Pascal talking about we are a thinking reed. We are such delicate creatures, but that's the one thing that we have over the rest of the universe. These little tiny bacteria size, almost, representations. So Proust writes about Bergot and the little patch of yellow wall. I'll just leave you with what I think offers us some solution to the pessimism of T.S. Eliot and the wasteland under the red rock. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. But under Cezanne's red rock, what you can see is a little patch of orange sand. A little patch of orange sand. Well, I hope you've enjoyed that. Until the next time, all the very best. Take care.